Hello, and welcome to Module 10, Texas and the Western Frontier. This Module 10 will focus on the many ways that Texas changed at the turn of the 19th century. The book focuses on the cattle boom and tensions along the U.S.-Mexico border. You'll need to read the essays carefully this week, as I will not be focusing on the border tensions at this particular point in time, but will instead focus on internal political tensions and the rise of the cattle industry in Texas. I will also be focusing on the manner in which Texas's agricultural society attempted to ease the economic burdens of the Gilded Age, a period of immense economic instability and inequality at the same time as it has also quite a lot of economic growth. But for ranchers and farmers, that type of economic growth is ultimately limited, and we'll talk a little bit about how that affects Texas in terms of the rise of what historians call populism. Texas has always been a little bit of a populist state, and so this week we'll take a look at some of the different populist movements that have happened in Texas from the 1870s into the 1890s. So this week's learning objectives include to understand the changes to Texas in the aftermath of Reconstruction. We'll be finishing up with that. To understand the manner in which Anglos pushed into West Texas, and to understand the evolution of populism and the cattle boom. So first, please, if you're on the PowerPoint, please turn to slide 2, and we'll talk about what they call redemption and the Democrats and white supremacy prevailing. So during the election of 1873, Edmund Davis again ran on the Republican ticket, while Richard Koch, who you can see pictured on slide 2, who was an ex-Confederate, campaigned as a conservative Democrat. During the campaign, Davis highlighted the programs he had initiated, while Koch and his followers talked about redemption, or restoring strong states' rights and overthrowing the coalition of what they called freedmen and Republicans. But make no mistake, redemption doesn't necessarily mean the positive thing that it sounds like it is. So it means a return to absolute white supremacy is what redemption actually means. Republicans managed to get out more voters than they had before, but it was not enough to prevail against the Democrats. The Democrats won by a landslide in Texas. However, the election was ultimately deemed illegal, and the court eventually, though, sided with the Democrats, and Koch was sworn in as governor. Koch's victory spelled the end of Reconstruction in Texas, especially when you combine it with a gradual retreat from Reconstruction by the U.S. federal government. Richard Koch appealed to business interests who recognized his moderate endorsement of railroad and industrial expansion, but also to a rural constituency. His perceived support for some agrarian goals won for him the undying loyalty of an organization called the Patrons of Husbandry, a farmers' society better known as the Grange. According to the thinking of Democrats like Koch, Republicans had destroyed Southern prosperity and upset the region's traditional forms of white supremacy and racial relationships. They suggested that the agricultural depression of 1870, which grew into the industrial panic of 1873, was actually the fruit of Republican misrule. Most historians don't agree with this. There are a lot of other economic issues that go into the Panic of 1873, and also the very real cost of the Civil War. Economic cost of the Civil War was also something that contributed to economic downturns in the 1870s. But Democrats obviously focused on Republicans and Republican rule. The Democrats' solution to the future included the endorsement of an idea called the New South. the concept that, and this is the concept that the South should ultimately in many ways emulate the North in order to industrialize, which many New Southers really thought was going to be the way toward economic prosperity in the American South. And the way to industrialize, according to New South advocates, was to hold down the expense of government, lower taxes, and create an inexpensive labor supply. Such measures would attract northern investment and industry to the southern states. So we'll talk now about the end of Reconstruction in Texas and how that evolved. The Grange, first I'll spend some time talking about the Grange. So the Grange, this was initially an organization that was organized by a gentleman named R.A. Baird, B-A-I-R-D, who is the first person to really organize the Grange in Texas. So there's a larger national organization, and then Baird is responsible for establishing the Grange in Texas at Salado in July of 1873. So this organization is ultimately a nonpartisan agrarian order that offered to farm families its fourfold plan for cooperation in business, happier home lives, more social contacts, and better educational opportunities. That's the Grange's fourfold plan. In October, delegates of 1873, in October, delegates organized the Texas State Grange in Dallas. So in 1876, the Texas Grange, including parts of the Indian Territory where many farmers had begun to settle, claimed upwards of 40,000 patron, matron, and juvenile members. Yes, men, women, and children were all included in the Grange. And the members were organized into over 1,000 lodges, or sort of like home bases for the Grange organization. In 1879, there were about 352 members and 122 clubs. So there is sort of like a downturn a little bit in the Grange, but then it very quickly becomes quite popular again, and then at its height it was roughly official members of the Grange in 1884 were roughly about 13,402, but in 1870s there was like there were about 40,000 people who were involved in the Grange in some way, shape, or form. So the Grange gradually declines until we get to the 20th century, but the organization itself did achieve some victories. Half of the membership of the Constitutional Convention of 1875, which we will talk much more about, were patrons dedicated to what they call retrenchment in government. Articles providing low salaries for public officers, lower salaries for public officers, homestead protection, railway regulation, and restriction on taxing power show Grange influence in the Constitution and the Constitutional Convention in 1875. Those are all things that they supported and the organization supported. Laws encouraging immigration, checking land speculative companies or land speculation, setting maximum interstate rates, regulating railways by a commission, and requiring a 6-month school term, and the election of public weighers, or all originated with the Grange organization in Texas. So we'll talk a bit about what comes out of the Constitutional Convention, which is the Constitution of 1876. Yes, that's right, another one. So white Texans hoped to erase all the vestiges of the Constitution of 1869 and Republican office under Reconstruction. Most of the delegates to the Constitutional Convention wanted provisions that prohibited the state from chartering banks, empowering the state, if it should choose to do so, to regulate corporations and railroad companies. They also wanted to empower or they also wanted the Constitution to establish a state debt ceiling of about $200,000. Members of this convention and white Democrats alike also wanted to put a strict limit on the maximum tax rate and all but abolish the public school system. However, the convention did endow a permanent school fund with revenue for lands previously set aside for the support of the public schools, and they added this fund. They added to this fund monies derived from the sale of 1/2 of the unreserved sections of the public domain or public land. So they essentially were in the process of trying to at least set aside some land for the development of public schools, even though the public school system was not overly popular, according to Democrats and Texans, or primarily white Texans. The conventioners took land, actually, though, from the University of Texas and moved it to the west on different land, where it would actually later discover pools of oil. Democrats sought to lower government salaries, and this resulted in part from the Grange, but also in part from the idea that Republicans had misused funds in Texas under the Edmund Davis administration. Though, like I had said in the last module, in Module 9, there really isn't too much evidence that Davis actually did misuse funds. So this is largely a lot of politicking on the part of the Democrats. The two most controversial decisions that shaped the fate of Texas include these. Many were, in the aftermath of Reconstruction, were upset with the centralization and the expense of the public school system. Many delegates to the Constitutional Convention argued that parents should bear the sole responsibility for educating their children. The argument came in part from those who rejected the idea that white landowners should pay taxes for the education of black children. Others, in particular grangers and other family farmers, favored local educational control as a way to save money and to establish community schools with terms that corresponded with crop cycles. Both groups opposed compulsory attendance to public schools. Consequently, the new Constitution authorized a $1 tax on males between the age of 21 and 60 to the state to support some form of education or some form of public school in Texas. But it made no provision for local taxes to fund community schools. While the new document eliminated the office of the state superintendent and compulsory education, it mandated segregated schools. The Texas school system was already inadequate even by 19th century standards, and it had received a weakening blow with these parts of the Constitution that had developed in 1876. The Constitution was in line, though, with current political views of most white Southerners throughout the American South. Similar policies happened throughout the former Confederate states, and it was largely due to many of these policies that the region remained plagued with poverty and poorly educated. These policies displayed a general distrust, though, of activist governments and a desire to limit their powers as a result of Reconstruction. So we'll turn now to the fate of freedmen towards the end of Reconstruction. The former slaves whose status was central to Reconstruction in reality found themselves only partially liberated. Freedmen's settlements were independent rural communities of African American landowners and land squatters that formed in the eastern half of Texas in the years after emancipation. These freed colonies, freedom colonies, as African Americans sometimes called them, were to a degree anomalies in the post-war Texas world, where white power elites rapidly resumed social, economic, and political control. And the agricultural system of sharecropping quickly came to dominate the entire state, even though these freedom colonies were attempting to give African Americans some level of economic autonomy. Practice followed within Texas and within Texas society. Practice followed social customs rather than legal dictates for no state law, because no state law required racial separation during Reconstruction, but the social practice that quickly developed after emancipation was one of segregation in some way. Jim Crow evolved very quickly after Reconstruction. Tenancy and sharecropping arose throughout the Reconstruction era in the South. Both of these forms of agriculture were largely methods of labor control. In return for land, seed, fertilizer, tools, food, farm animals, and other essentials, black sharecroppers delivered a good portion of their year's crop to the landowner. Freedmen at first liked the arrangement as it actually permitted them a degree of independence and provided a release from gang labor and direct supervision of whites or from whites. Black sharecroppers established their own work schedules, which meant a great deal to them. Sharecropping by both blacks and whites, because both did sharecropping, seldom led to prosperity, and most freedmen faced chronic indebtedness, as did most poor whites who were also involved in sharecropping. In Texas, a measure of the sharecroppers were also actually Mexican American or Mexican by the time we get to the 1870s and 1880s. By the mid-1870s, many rural blacks had become tenants or tenant farmers, with their families destined to work together under a white landlord. Those who labored for salaries on the old plantations experienced other kinds of miseries, and urban African Americans vying with discrimination and competing with new laborers arriving from the countryside had little choice but to take the most undesirable and low-paying jobs. So freedom on the surface initially had meant possible economic uplift, possible political voice in the southern states, but as we move into the 1880s and the end of Reconstruction, those rights become steadily more and more restricted by forms of social and legal segregation. So I'll talk also a little bit about the formation of black communities. At the end of the Civil War, not only did African Americans have to understand what freedom meant, but many of them had to go about reconstructing their lives or constructing their lives for the first time. Freedmen lived in difficult conditions during this period. 1- and 2-room shacks, high infant mortality rates were quite common within black communities. African Americans sought to strengthen family ties, legalize their marriages, and find family members in the aftermath of the Civil War. They asserted gender roles that were actually similar to white gender roles, with men being the heads of household and women restricted to more subordinate status. In 1870, Texas formally legalized black marriages, which afforded many families a sort of long sought-after stability. Black communities quickly established their own churches and congregations with black ministers. Methodist and Baptist churches became centers of the black community and helped them resist the increasing oppression that was happening to them. Black Texans established their own centers of worship, structuring their respective institutions' hierarchy and Christian message to fit their own experiences. Religious services, social activities, educational institutions, political planning, and an office for sort of miscellaneous services such as helping African Americans find jobs could all be found in the black community, and many of those things were actually centered in the churches that developed in African American communities. African Americans also formed what they called benevolent associations or benevolent agencies to aid the less fortunate members of their communities. Benevolent associations are actually quite common throughout the 1870s and 1880s. These are the organizations that are supposed to help the impoverished throughout the United States. It's not really Americans don't view it as the responsibility of the federal government to do that at this point in time. So African Americans are really in step with most of the rest of the United States. So self-improvement and was an incredibly important part of Black Reconstruction. So many African American communities set about building schools, and even churches also offered schooling for adults or classes at night to help adults become educated. The rise of Jim Crow and segregation saw the fortunes of Black Texans severely limited. Jim Crow, as it became popularly known, was a combination of laws and social customs that whites erected to control the liberties of African Americans. Segregation segregates African Americans from the mainstream community. Segregation laws do not segregate white people, although social custom does segregate both African Americans and whites to a certain extent. But legal segregation focuses entirely on the movement of African Americans. So with white-controlled governments back in power by the end of the 1870s, the situation for Southern blacks gradually deteriorated. In the 1880s, legislation strengthened segregation in the South. Within 20 years, every Southern state had enacted some segregation as law. The earliest laws legalized segregation in trains and other forms of public transportation. Jim Crow statutes separated the races in almost all public places except streets and stores. By the 1890s, this system of segregation had become firmly entrenched throughout the South. And in 1896, the federal government sanctioned racial segregation, fashioning the constitutional rationale for keeping races legally apart. In the case of Plessy versus Ferguson, the Supreme Court ruled that a Louisiana law providing for equal but separate accommodations for whites and what they were calling coloreds did not violate the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. Segregation as both a social and political and economic system is upheld by extreme amounts of violence that happened throughout the 1870s and 1880s. And we will talk much more about that system of violence as we move forward into the next modules in the coming weeks. We'll turn now to talking about the cattle boom. So first we'll talk about the origins of the cattle boom and the push into West Texas. The push into West Texas occurred primarily in the 1870s as Reconstruction was really centered in East Texas. Most of what lived in West Texas were Native Americans who did not necessarily feel the effects of Reconstruction, though they did certainly feel the presence, the increased presence of the U.S. Army. And this is a U.S. Army that is fresh from the Civil War and has sort of learned how to conduct warfare in many ways through the Civil War. And the lessons of warfare will be used in the West in the coming years of the 1870s through the 1890s when we talk about the end of the Indian Wars. But I want you to keep in mind that the end of the Indian Wars in the 1890s actually is the end of a centuries-long contest between the indigenous and Euro-Americans, and it is also not the end of the existence of Indian people in the United States. And the indigenous continue on throughout the end of the 19th century and into the 20th century, and theirs is really a story of struggle, but also of quite remarkable resistance. So we'll talk about how Anglos in Texas began to push into West Texas. So the push into West Texas in the 1870s resulted from the outcome of war between Anglos and Indians. Reservations were established in the Indian Territory by the 1870s. And offensive attacks against the Comanche and Kiowa, which is the only tribe or the only nation to ever have been able to negotiate any type of survival arrangement with the Comanche, did not begin until the early 1870s. The Salt Creek Massacre of 1871, which was committed by the Kiowa from the Fort Sill Reservation in Indian Territory. This attack changed a lot about Indian policy. The U.S. Army military offensive after Salt Creek was headed by a gentleman named Colonel Randall Slidell Mackenzie, Mackenzie, and included actually his command actually included an African American unit as well as white units and cavalry units. So the Army went after Comanche bands primarily, even though it was the Kiowa that actually committed this Salt Creek Massacre. And they went after Comanche bands in the Panhandle Plains, where we are today, and in Lubbock. And among these, the Comanche of this particular time, many of the Comanche bands were under a gentleman by the name of Quanah Parker, who was a Comanche Indian chief who rose to prominence in the 1870s and actually provided quite a stabilizing figure for many Comanche people as they began to be forced onto reservations. So to push the Comanche onto the reservations, the Army went about slaughtering the Indians' pony herds. They razed entire Indian villages to the ground and confiscated food, weapons, utensils, and blankets, which the Indians needed to survive out in the southern plains. The initial assault on Indians in northwest Texas came in 1873 after Comanche, Kiowa, and Cheyenne groups attacked a buffalo hunters camp at Adobe Walls in 1874. So the Mackenzie group, the Army under Mackenzie, came upon a Comanche village at Palo Duro Canyon. After dispersing the Indians following a brief skirmish, he ordered the destruction of that particular band's pony herds, and by mid-1875, Indians began going toward the Oklahoma reservations for survival. The Comanche loss of power was not just the result of a military effort, but it was also a result of the war on their way of life, which actually took place throughout the American West. The destruction of the buffalo herds by the 1870s and 1880s made it near impossible to survive in the traditional manner of the Plains tribes or the Plains nations. The introduction of livestock such as horses, cattle, and sheep imported by Western Anglos or Westering Anglos contaminated the buffalo herds with fatal diseases and upset the ecology of the plains. By the 1880s, less than 200 buffalo were left on their old Texas feeding grounds, where untold thousands had once roamed. But that removal of the Indians to reservations is also what sets the stage for the rise of the cattle industry in West Texas. This ends part 1 of Lecture 10. Thank you.